Every enemy raid was on a large scale. The bombers thundered over regularly, disdainfully flying in large formations in which weak defensive gaps were readily apparent. Had we taken advantage of these formation faults, we could have exacted a heavy toll on the enemy bombers. However, the enemy's confidence was well-founded. In the face of such large formations, our numerically inferior Zeros were utterly helpless. Had the Zero fighter been superior in performance to the enemy planes, we might have been able to deal the enemy a heavy blow. But no longer could the Zero flaunt its performance, for the former terror of the Pacific now ran a poor second to the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, and could not hope to engage the Corsairs and Lightnings unless the enemy fighter pilots so desired. With basically the same fighter airplane we had used at the war's beginning, we could not hope to do much against an enemy who pursued technological progress so prodigiously. There are other factors in aerial combat even more important than the quality of the individual opposing aircraft, and perhaps the most vital of these is having experienced pilots and air crews. After every mission, the Americans sent out flying boats to the areas in which their planes had fought, searching for and rescuing air crews which had been shot down and stood a good chance of surviving aboard life rafts. Every lumbering flying boat, normally an easy catch for our fighter planes, went out on its search mission with 9 to 12 escort fighters. Although their duties were extremely hazardous, the crews of these flying boats performed their missions gallantly, and there arose few occasions during the war when groups of men so consistently exposed themselves to multiple dangers. Our pilots could not fail to be impressed with these daring search missions, and despite the fact that enemy pilots manned the flying boats, our men regarded them as unusually courageous. On the other hand, although the Japanese High Command realized, perhaps in theory only, the value of saving human lives, and believed that every human life should be held as irreplaceable, they would not emulate the American rescue policy. Our naval commanders were so afraid of the possible sacrifices which might be the consequences of attempting to rescue our crews, which were shot down, that often we abandoned on the open sea those men whom we could obviously have saved. The naval command's attitude toward the situation was that they could not tolerate the possible loss of a large flying boat merely to effect the certain rescue of one air crew. I pondered this situation more than once, for this apathy toward rescuing downed pilots was not merely the attitude of the High Command. Our own combat men, the flying mates of the same men who were shot down and adrift at sea, would not, even under orders, take any unnecessary chances to save their lives. Lest this attitude be misconstrued as indicating that our men lacked compassion for their friends, it should be added that they would not expect otherwise should they be the ones to be shot down. Any man who was shot down and managed to survive by inflating his life raft realized that his chance for continued survival lay entirely within his own hands. Our pilots accepted their abandonment stoically. At any rate, the entire Japanese Navy failed to evince any great interest in rescue operations of this nature. There were exceptions, of course, and during my final stay at Rabaul, the seaplane group commander proved to be one of these. He and his men often flew dangerous missions to save the lives of those aircrew members downed at sea. Their seaplanes were small and few in number. Despite their most intensive efforts, they could do little. These were some of the behind-the-scenes factors at Rabaul. Our situation worsened steadily, and finally reached the point where we were deluged by a storm of enemy bombs and bullets. Clearly, we could not remain much longer at Rabaul. Incredibly, all during my stay, I did not once become ill. Every last member of Rear Admiral Jojima's staff, including the Admiral, suffered either from dengue fever or malaria, or both. Perhaps the reasons why I escaped sickness was that, although I had had land duty longer than any member of the headquarters staff, and I was obliged to remain outdoors longer than usual, I always exercised the greatest care in selecting food and water. Further, I ignored the oppressive heat and wore nothing but long trousers and boots. These were not as comfortable, I admit, as the cooler short trousers, but they were preferable to fever and illness. On February 20th, 1944, after having lost the majority of its men and most of its planes in a single harrowing month of incessant battle, the 2nd Carrier Division gave up the fight for Rabaul. The embittered division abandoned this vital airbase and withdrew to Truk. With Rabaul abandoned to the enemy, the Navy realized that soon it would be forced to commit its planes and ships to another vital defense operation. American aircraft carrier task forces roamed the entire Pacific Ocean in unbelievable strength, hammering with rapid blows at even our strongest island bastions. By the end of May of 1944, it appeared probable that the Marianas were next on the list for an all-out assault. When the Americans finally struck, it was with overwhelming quantitative and qualitative power. So severely beaten were our sea, air, and land forces that the Battle of the Mariana Islands drove Prime Minister Hideki Tojo from office. Further, the loss in ships and planes so crippled the Navy that it was never able again to engage the enemy in what could be described as a well-organized operation. By late 1943, the Navy High Command realized that the Pacific War was rapidly approaching its climax. America's devastating carrier task force assaults, especially against the Gilbert and Marshall Island groups, proved beyond any doubt that the enemy regarded our surface fleet strength with increasing disdain. Tokyo realized further that the Marianas' attack was but a matter of time. We would be called on to defend this crucial island with our maximum strength, and many of our officers feared that the anticipated American assault would be the war's last decisive battle. The United States possessed far greater air and naval strength, and increased its advantage by employing fighter planes considerably superior to the aging Zero. There was good reason to believe that the Marianas conflict might give the enemy the final advantage necessary to defeat Japan. Should American Marines and troops successfully occupy the islands, then the Japanese homeland itself would fall within the effective bombing range of the Army Air Force's new B-29 bomber, which could well cripple our production. We had never seen the B-29, but Navy intelligence believed it had completely reliable information on the airplane, obtained from a former B-29 test pilot who had been shot down in the Solomon Islands in the summer of 1943. The information later proved to be accurate. Another danger arising from American occupation of the Marianas was that the enemy could employ the islands as a home base for their aircraft carriers, which could then strike directly at New Guinea, the Philippine Islands, and even the Japanese mainland. A successful American move in this direction would gravely imperil our position in the Pacific. Even should our army remain intact in the Philippines and on Formosa and Okinawa, the enemy carrier task forces, long-range land-based bombers and submarines could cut the vital communications lines between our factories and our sources of raw materials in the Pacific. Not only would our industry suffer, but the loss of these supply lines would create serious food shortages among our people. With these factors to consider, the Navy prepared to hurl against the expected enemy attack every available airplane and warship. The Marianas' defense was to be a maximum effort. We would greet the Americans with an impenetrable wall of fire and steel. To make certain that our planes would be flown by veterans as well as novices, the Navy drew instructors from its training air corps and assigned them to the front. Every serviceable plane and ship moved into the area of decision. Even before the two great opponents were committed to battle, however, our defense preparations suffered what proved later to be a damaging blow. The Navy knew almost for a certainty that the showdown would come soon, but could not convince the Army of the urgent need for immediate action. General Hideki Tojo, then Minister of the Army as well as Prime Minister, stated emphatically that there existed no need for such feverish and hysterical defences, since the Americans would not attack in strength. So believing, he refused to commit a single Army plane to the Mariana Islands. We could do nothing to disabuse him of his mistaken confidence. On June 11, 1944, the enemy carrier task forces began their bombardment of the Marianas. At the time, the Japanese combined fleet defense lines consisted of the following: Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, directed the overall operations from his headquarters aboard his flagship Oyodo in Hiroshima Bay. Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuda, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, land-based aircraft, controlled approximately 1,000 warplanes. Operating from headquarters on Tinian Island, he assigned his planes to the Marianas, Carolines, Iwo Jima, and Truk. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the 1st Task Fleet and the 3rd Fleet, was assigned a carrier task force made up of the largest number of aircraft carriers gathered together since the Hawaiian operation. His force waited for the oncoming battle at Tawi Tawi anchorage in the southwest area of the Sulu Sea, west of the Philippine Islands. Under Ozawa's command was a fleet of 73 vessels, including 9 aircraft carriers, and the 74 000-ton battleships Yamato and Musashi, each with 9 18-inch guns. Admiral Ozawa's orders were to coordinate his movements with the Kakuda land-based air fleets. To conserve his limited fuel supply, Ozawa elected to remain as long as possible at Tawi Tawi before engaging the enemy. In addition to these forces, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, Commander-in-Chief of the Central Pacific Fleet and the commander of the Pearl Harbor attack, controlled the Marines and other naval units which were to defend the Marianas against enemy amphibious operations. On June 13th, the enemy confirmed our worst fears and began the initial aerial bombardment against the Marianas. Fighters and bombers in great number attacked ground positions of the islands, pursued all shipping in the area, and began to exact a heavy toll of our defending planes. Admiral Toyoda ordered the Ozawa force to move against the enemy fleet at once. Unfortunately, Ozawa had to refuel his ships and could not arrive west of the beleaguered islands prior to June 18th. During the week necessary for Ozawa's carriers to reach the Marianas, the Kakuda land-based air force waged a desperate defense against the swarms of enemy carrier-based fighters and bombers. It was a losing battle from the start, and Kakuda's available airplanes decreased alarmingly in strength, forfeiting control of the local air to the Americans. Their planes pounded Kakuda's positions mercilessly, destroying vital installations and causing heavy casualties to his men. Kakuda's pilots lacked the training necessary to offer strong resistance to the aggressive American pilots, and the defending Zeros fought hopeless battles against the marauding Hellcat fighters, which outperformed and outnumbered our own planes. Our dive bombers and torpedo bombers launched several raids against the enemy carriers, but never stood a chance against the determined defense of the Hellcat fighters and the unbelievable accuracy and volume of the ship's anti-aircraft guns. By the time Ozawa arrived at the scene of battle, Kakuda's defences had been shattered. Most of his planes were gone, he lacked experienced pilots, and the Marianas installations were reduced to a shambles. The Americans could not have planned their operation better. Events occurred almost as if we were cooperating with the attack, for by the time the Ozawa force drew within bomber range of the American carriers, Kakuda's land-based planes no longer existed as an operational air fleet. He had been so soundly defeated that Ozawa was forced to fight alone, without the support from Kakuda for which he had originally hoped. Of the 2 major opposing air groups the Americans were called on to face, they first virtually annihilated the land-based units, then turned, with almost their original strength intact, to deal with Ozawa. Our intelligence reported that the Americans were attacking the Marianas in 4 separate carrier groups, with a total of 12 aircraft carriers. Against these, Ozawa had 9 such ships in 3 groups, with the 3 largest carriers, the Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, 2 medium carriers, the Yunyo and the Hiyo, and the 4 smaller ships, the Ryuho, Chiyoda, Chitose, and Zuiho. The 1st Carrier Division, under the direct command of Vice Admiral Ozawa, consisted of the Taiho, Shokaku, and the Zuikaku. Aboard these 3 large vessels were the 601st Air Corps with 81 Zeros, 9 Type 2 Judy reconnaissance planes, 81 Judy dive bombers, Suisei, and 54 JIL attack bombers, Tenzan. Each carrier accommodated approximately a third of the total striking force. Under Rear Admiral Takaji Jojima's command was the 2nd Carrier Division with the Junyo, Hiyo, and the Ryuho. Aboard the 3 carriers were the 652nd Air Corps 81 Zeros, 27 Val dive bombers, 9 Type 2 Judy dive bombers, and 27 JIL attack bombers. The 3rd group was Rear Admiral Sueo Obayashi's 3rd Carrier Division with the Chiyoda, Chitose, and the Zuiho, which carried the 653rd Air Corps' 63 Zeros, 6 Jills, and 12 Kates. The 9 aircraft carriers accommodated a total of 450 planes, or more than 50 planes over the maximum number available to the Nagumo force which attacked Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, Ozawa had a greater advantage in that he controlled 9 aircraft carriers, not 6. If he were to lose one or more of these carriers, he could minimize his aircraft losses by landing the planes from a sunken vessel aboard its sister ships. The 9 carriers concentrated at Tawi-Tawi were regarded by many of our naval officers as assurance of victory in the Marianas battle. We had never assembled in one striking force so much carrier aviation, and our pilots were convinced that they would shatter the attacking American fleet. It appears, however, that these people who enjoyed such premature success thought only in terms of the total available aircraft carriers and their planes, failing to give due consideration to the human factor. Vital to every battle is the indefinable element we term aggressiveness, or spirit, or esprit de corps. Whatever it is, the Americans had it. Our forces lacked the close coordination and unity of the American groups, and so were at a disadvantage. Those officers who boasted, prior to the battle of course, of the terrible havoc our fleet would wreak among the Americans were due to suffer terrible disappointments. On June 19th, the great carrier versus carrier air battles began, west of the Mariana Islands. Ozawa threw every available airplane against the American carriers in an all-out attempt to destroy the American ships. The effort failed to produce any results whatsoever, and while Ozawa suffered considerable losses to his fighters and bombers, the American ships sailed on undaunted. Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, informed that our carriers were several hundred miles from his own vessels, wisely decided to postpone his bomber attacks against our fleet. Instead, he ordered every Hellcat fighter plane into the air to meet our attacking bombers. As a result of this fierce resistance from enemy planes, which easily outflow our own aircraft, only a few bombers managed to break through the American fighter screen to the carriers. Here they met a veritable cyclone of anti-aircraft fire. The results of the attack were negligible. Ozawa, on the other hand, lost the majority of his planes in the battle, and simultaneously lost what future advantage he had hoped for in the way of making mass air attacks against the enemy. Ozawa's powerful aircraft carrier force did not suffer the expected enemy aerial attack, and even as his men began to relax with the realization that the American planes were not approaching, disaster struck. Aboard his flagship, Taiho, Ozawa received word from his radio room that a submarine attack was underway. The next moment, at 0800, the Taiho literally blew up under his feet. The enemy submarine Albacore had loosed 6 torpedoes, most of which struck the Taiho, but Japan's newest and strongest 35,000-ton carrier neither listed nor slackened her speed. Despite the comparatively minor damage of the torpedo strikes, gasoline vapor from a broken large tank and pipelines gradually seeped out to fill the entire interior of the big carrier. Ozawa was obliged to transfer by destroyer to the cruiser Haguro. 90 minutes after the Albacore fired her torpedoes, Taiho was racked by a tremendous explosion. The tremendous detonations shattered all control aboard the vessel, and at 1640 hours she went down. Ready to board his new flagship, Ozawa suffered another blow. At 11:20 hours, another enemy submarine had attacked, and 4 of the 6 torpedoes fired by the Kavala had shattered the Shokaku. The great carrier blew apart several hours later and sank. Ill fortune did not stop here. On the following day, June so, Ozawa changed his flagship to the Zuikaku and prepared to launch a maximum-effort bombing and torpedo attack against the American fleet. Even as the planes were being fueled and armed, enemy dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter planes in great numbers raided our carriers. The American attack was savage and well executed. Split asunder by bombs and torpedoes, the Hiyo went down, along with 2 tankers loaded with critically needed fuel. The Zuikaku, Junyo, Ryuho, and Chiyoda all suffered heavy damage, as did the battleship Haruna and another tanker. Reeling from the devastating blow, Ozawa's carriers launched a punitive night attack with 10 torpedo bombers. none of our planes could hit the enemy carriers. The combination of sea and air losses shattered the effectiveness of Ozawa's task force as a fighting unit. It was impossible for him even to attempt a comeback against the formidable American fleet, which stormed, almost without a scratch, against his fleeing ships. The Americans called their smashing air victory the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and with good reason. With the battle concluded, Ozawa had only 47 airplanes in fighting shape, 25 Zeros, 6 torpedo bombers, 2 dive bombers, and 12 miscellaneous aircraft. The enemy losses were trifling in comparison, for they lost but 26 aircraft in combat. Thus ended the Marianas Sea Battle, which our Navy had entered with the greatest carrier and air strength in its history. The great battle concluded with the Navy suffering its worst defeat, the consequences of which exceeded even our losses at Midway. We examined the various phases of the action in an attempt to determine what had denied Admiral Ozawa the victory, which, on paper at least, his great carrier and air strength should have afforded. As Air Staff Officer to Rear Admiral Jojima, 2nd Carrier Division, Y. Okumiya, had available the data from which I drew the following conclusions. First, our aircrews lacked the training necessary to coordinate their attacks in combat. For 2 years prior to the Marianas battle, I had been the 2nd Carrier Division's Air Staff Officer, and at no time did I feel that our air group leaders possessed the minimum capabilities required for combat leadership. The preceding 2 years had witnessed a marked lowering of the requirements necessary for air group leadership, and it soon became obvious that we were entrusting vital combat command to men who were greatly in need of further operational training. When I was first assigned to the air staff of the 4th Carrier Division, just prior to the Midway Aleutian operation, the Nagumo Force's overall air group leader was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack against Pearl Harbor. Fuchida had graduated from the 52nd, 1924 class of the Etajima Naval Academy. In the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki was Nagumo's overall air group leader. Like myself, Seki entered Etajima in 1927 as a member of the 58th, 1930 graduating class. However, the air group leaders who participated in the Marianas battle included Lieutenant Commander Jotaro Iwami of the Jojima Force from the 62nd, 1934 graduating class, and Lieutenant Commander Akira Tarui of the Ozawa Force, and Lieutenant Commander Masayuki Yamagami of the Obayashi Force from the 64th, 1936 graduating class. In other words, in only the 2 odd short years since I was appointed to the Carrier Division's air staff, the average age of the senior air group leaders had dropped by at least 10 years. Unfortunately, too, the skill of the air crews which flew in the Marianas conflict had deteriorated in direct proportion to the average reduced age of their commanding officers. One example especially illustrates the marked loss of combat flying skill. When my carrier force, the 2nd Carrier Division, joined the Santa Cruz battle, our dive bomber pilots had established and maintained an enviable rate of accuracy in their attack. In a bombing operation by 9 planes against the target ship Setsu, an old battleship 160 meters in length and 20 meters in width, which could maintain an evasive pattern speed of 16 knots on the open sea, the 9 planes frequently scored 9 hits. Just prior to the Marianas fight, however, the same 9-plane formation diving against the Setsu rarely scored more than 1 hit. We could not expect our air crews, only recently assigned to aircraft carriers, to achieve high flying skill and bombing accuracy in only a few weeks. And it was these men, sorely in need of months of training, who flew against the powerful, well-defended American fleet. Within 2.5 years after the war's start, our training standards and air crew proficiency had deteriorated to a point where the men stood little chance of survival against the enemy. The marked loss in minimum qualifications underscored dramatically the fact that our personnel preparations for this war never had been adequate. Second, there were few officers in the Ozawa force with experience in carrier versus carrier warfare, and this lack of familiarity with this type of conflict was clearly evident. Vice Admiral Ozawa, his chief of staff, his entire senior operations and air staffs, had never participated in a battle against enemy aircraft carriers. Moreover, with the exception of only 2 air staff officers, Vice Admiral Ozawa and his supporting staffs knew little about the problems of air groups. They had only the barest knowledge of aviation problems. Even Rear Admirals Jojima and Obayashi, who both had participated in combat as the captains of aircraft carriers, knew little about the intrinsic problems of general aircraft operation. With myself as the sole exception, the immediate staffs of Jojima and Obayashi all lacked carrier battle experience. As the Marianas conflict was to be waged against an American task force under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, the talented leader at Midway, I could not help but feel, prior to the battle, that we suffered from a severe handicap in leadership. Third, Ozawa lacked a sufficient number of high-performance aircraft, so necessary against the effective American defences. We still employed as our first-line carrier-based fighter plane the aging Zero. There did not exist in the Navy another plane with performance superior to that of the fighter which had fought in China in 1940. The 6 aircraft carriers under command of Jojima and Obayashi were slow and hampered by short carrier decks. It proved difficult, under ordinary conditions, to launch from these carriers the new Suisei Judy dive bombers brought into service after the Battle of Midway. The 9 Judys aboard the Junyo could not even be used for training purposes for the month while the fleet was anchored at Taui Taui. The carrier was too slow in the limited training area to launch its planes. Even the new Tenzan, Jill attack bombers were difficult to use efficiently when aboard the small aircraft carriers. Faced with these operational difficulties, and also searching for increased escort fighter coverage, the Navy experimented with the Zero fighters as dive bombers, carrying a 550-pound bomb. 9 modified Zero fighter bombers went aboard each carrier of the Jojima force, and each of Obayashi's 3 carriers received 12 Zero fighter bombers. A total of 63 modified Zero fighters were placed aboard Ozawa's 6 carriers, and these planes were broken up into 2 special attack groups. Led by the Tenzan attack bombers, which provided navigational direction, the 2 Zero fighter bomber groups left their ships on June 19th to attack the enemy task force. Our hopes for the new plane's victory were fruitless. Our Zero pilots, covering nearly 350 nautical miles to the enemy fleet, arrived in exhausted condition, unable to fly with their usual skill. Nearing the American carriers, they ran into an effective defensive screen of Hellcat fighters and suffered severe losses. This final effort dropped the curtain on our Navy's complete defeat at the Mariana Islands. It was evident, however, that although the Zero fighter bomber required assistance in long-range navigation, it achieved better results against enemy carriers than did any of our dive bombers. This sudden increase in bombing accuracy was the greatest single cause of the sudden rise of the famous kamikaze suicide squads, which participated in the hopeless sea battle off Leyte Island in the Philippines 4 months later. Thus, the Zero fighter plane, which once had been the undisputed master of fighter plane combat in the Western Pacific and the Indian Oceans, seemed destined to play a further leading role in the Pacific Air War. Not, however, any longer as the champion of air combat, but as the main character in the mounting tragedies which prophesied only the total defeat of Japan. If the war leaders of our nation had at that time realized the true condition of our naval air force, they would certainly have made a serious effort to conclude the war as rapidly as possible. Had such negotiations been undertaken, the kamikaze suicide attacks would never have occurred, and much loss of life, both Japanese and American, could have been averted. In this sense, especially, our failure to defend successfully the Marianas played a significant role in the history of the Pacific War. During the great air battles of the Pacific War, many pilots, while directly over enemy warships or land installations, were caught in situations in which either they were seriously wounded or their aircraft became disabled. Under such conditions, not a few pilots chose, while it was still possible to maneuver their airplanes, to meet their end in a final suicide dive against the enemy objective. These occasions, not at all rare in air assaults, were not suicide attacks in the true sense of the word, since the pilot stood almost no chance of survival. There were instances, of course, when certain individuals elected to sacrifice their lives in order to accomplish their missions, but these were isolated cases. The kamikaze attack, however, was an entirely different matter. In this operation, the pilot, or the entire crew of an attacking aircraft, eliminated even the remotest opportunity for survival once committed to the final dive against the enemy. Death was the companion of the kamikaze pilot, as it was of the kaiten, the human torpedoes employed in the war's latter stages. There has been, and there will continue to be, much criticism of the Japanese Navy for adopting for the first time anywhere the deliberate mass suicide method of attacking the enemy. The kamikaze operations have evoked much dissension among our own people, for such tactics cannot help but to be accompanied by incomparable mental anguish and sacrifice on the part of all concerned. I neither condemn nor condone the decisions which led to and maintained the kamikaze flights, but present here the developments leading up to and following the decision finally to launch the suicide attack. The Zero fighter, long the Navy's mainstay against enemy air operations, again played a leading part in our military activities through its position as the most widely used kamikaze aircraft. There were good reasons to employ the Zero fighter for this role, all of which were necessitated by combat inadequacies. Despite the severe losses sustained by the Navy in the Marianas Sea Battle, often described by the Americans as the Battle of the Philippines Sea, in which 3 large aircraft carriers went to the bottom, despite the fact that we no longer had available the air crews to man the remaining 6 carriers, and despite the fact that we could no longer reorganize a balanced fleet with our remaining vessels, Tokyo still elected to continue the war. After the Marianas debacle, the Zero still remained as the mainstay of the Navy's air fleets, outnumbering by a considerable margin any other type of plane. If the kamikaze attacks were to be instituted, then the Zero, by virtue of its available numbers and also because its performance made it the most likely airplane to break through the defending screen of Hellcat fighters, was the logical choice for the kamikaze groups. The human element, of course, contributed much to the final decision. Members of the Navy and the Army had been raised in an environment startlingly different from that of our enemies. The time-honored custom and sentiment of the Japanese people would not recognize existence as a prisoner of war. Capture by the enemy was to be feared even more than death, for such capture was always accompanied by disgrace to one's family and homeland. Rather than to surrender to the enemy and spend a life of shame, our men naturally considered, once they had been confronted with repeated and chaotic defeats, means of achieving an honorable and a glorious death. It was but a matter of time before the American fleet, incredibly powerful, and now clearly the master of the Pacific, launched the final all-out assault against the Philippine Islands. Our defending officers in the Philippines were faced with a problem apparently without solution. With a Navy Air Force comparable in strength to only one large American aircraft carrier, it was impossible to hurl back the colossal attack which the enemy clearly would soon begin. If we could not entertain the possibility of surrender, and if accepted means of defense obviously would be impossible, the Philippines Navy air commanders could not help but turn to tactics which until then had never been employed. Under these circumstances, then, the Japanese Navy Air Force planned and finally executed the kamikaze suicide attack. With all the air bases in the Mariana and Caroline Islands and along the northern coast of New Guinea in the hands of the enemy by early September of 1944, the rich prize of recapturing the Philippines tantalized the Americans. Before they could dispatch even their formidable fleets, with the thin-hulled and vulnerable transport ships to the shores of the islands, they must first destroy or render inoperative the air bases from which our fighters and bombers could strike out at any invasion force. We could expect, then, first an attack by carrier task forces, which would be followed by a mass troop assault. The Navy Air Force received the responsibility for defending the Philippines, and upon our success or failure rested control of the great island group. With these assumptions as the basis for action, the first air fleet, with land-based aircraft, established its headquarters at Davao and began the reorganization of its units with those planes permanently assigned to the Philippines, as well as the surviving aircraft from the Mariana Islands. Our groups worked with feverish haste, but the mounting power of the Americans allowed them to strike with much greater speed and effectiveness than we had anticipated. On September 9, 1944, their task force closed in on the Philippines and blasted Davao for its first air raid of the war. The following day, with many of our ground installations already in wreckage, the carrier-based planes returned again to bomb and strafe the airfield. As the Davao attack raged, the Zero fighters then undergoing training at Clark Field on Luzon Island were hastily fueled and armed, and ordered to transfer immediately to our base on Cebu Island in the central Philippines. The fighters arrived too late to participate in Davao's defense, for the Americans had completed their attack and withdrawn to the open sea. Or so we thought. 2 days later, the carrier task force steamed under full speed for Cebu and launched an all-out aerial effort against our planes. Something happened to snarl our communications, and for some unknown reason Cebu Field failed to receive the proper notification of the attacking planes which our outposts had sighted on their way. The communications mix-up was fatal, for the arriving American pilots came upon a scene which not even they had hoped for. About 100 Zero fighters sat on the Cebu runways, ripe and helpless for an air attack. The Americans did not forfeit the rare opportunity. When the nightmare of screaming dive bombers and strafing fighters was over, more than 50 Zero fighters either were charred wreckage or had been blown to pieces. It was a loss of great magnitude. In a single stroke, the enemy had destroyed nearly 2/3 of our entire serviceable fighter plane force in the Philippines, and had left in damaged condition many other Zeros. By late August of 1944, I had returned to Japan as the Air Staff officer attached to the Naval General Staff of the Imperial Headquarters. As the American carrier force raided Cebu, I was flying under orders from Davao to the Cebu Air Base. My transport plane arrived on the scene almost simultaneously with the first wave of enemy fighters and bombers. Our pilot swung clear of the field lest we be caught by the Hellcats, which would quickly have shot us out of the sky. We were able to see, before the transport fled the area, the dive bombers plunging from the sky, and the fighter planes as they screamed back and forth over the field, their wing guns spitting tracers into the parked Zeros. Within minutes, Cebu became utter confusion. The American pilots were remarkably accurate, and the flames and black smoke boiling from the burning Zeros reminded me of a crematorium. That evening I returned to Manila and conferred with the pilots whose Zeros had been gunned and bombed into wreckage. The pilots were enraged at their helplessness and talked heatedly of revenge against the Americans at any cost. It was obvious that there would soon be radical changes in our battle tactics. In an attempt to overcome the effects of the devastating Cebu airfield attack, the Zeros were transferred from Cebu to Clark Field and Manila. Under the highest priority, Tokyo dispatched aircraft replacements, spares, fuel, and other material to rebuild the shattered fighter plane force. Even as the groups reformed, the American carrier planes struck again. On September 21st and 22, enemy fighters and dive bombers strafed and bombed the fields, once again breaking up the Zero groups. Another attempt to establish a powerful fighter defense in the Philippines had failed. Even as the American carrier planes swept over the Philippines, other large formations pounded our air bases on Okinawa on October 10th for the first raid against that island. From the 12th to the 14th, the irresistible American carrier-based planes thundered against Formosan air bases. On the 15th, they returned to Luzon Island to sweep our airfields into burning, tangled wreckage. Again, the carrier attacks frustrated our attempts to re-establish a defensive fighter plane force. Not only did we fail in every attempt to reinforce our fighter groups in the Philippines, but we could not even maintain our minimum strength. Every additional day meant a further drain on the planes which would be called on to defend the Philippines when the American troops first stormed ashore. Exactly when and where, however, was a matter yet to be determined. On October 17th, enemy troops invaded and secured their position on Suluan Island, east of Leyte. The situation in the Philippines was no longer merely serious, it had become critical. Admiral Soemu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Minaichi Koga was lost at sea in a Kawanishi flying boat on March 31st, judged that the Americans were making their all-out bid for the Philippine Islands, and, acting on plans long before prepared, started in motion his powerful defensive fleet. On the 17th, he ordered every warship in the entire Philippines area to proceed under full steam for the southeastern area of the island waters, there to assemble in battle formation. Simultaneously, he issued orders to his other fleet units, which included the Second Fleet under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, then in Singapore waters and consisting of the two 74,000-ton battleships Yamato and Musashi, 5 additional battleships, 9 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 23 destroyers. Vice Admiral Kyo Hideshima's Fifth Fleet of 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 7 destroyers then in the Formosa area, and Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Third Fleet of 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers, then in Hiroshima Bay. It was an imposing force, with 7 battleships, 2 of them the world's most powerful, 11 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, 38 destroyers, and 4 aircraft carriers. On the same day there arrived at Manila headquarters the new naval commander of the First Air Fleet, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi. Onishi was a capable veteran pilot who had assisted the late Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto over a period of many years. Onishi was personally responsible, along with Yamamoto, for the build-up of our naval air arm. As a rear admiral, he commanded the first air flotillas with Zero fighters in the Sino-Japanese incident. Assisted by Commander Minoru Genda, he drew up the original plans for the Pearl Harbor attack, and, when the war began, as the Chief of Staff to Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy Land-Based Air Force, he distinguished himself in the extensive aerial operations which extended from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. Now he returned to the battlefield where once he had led the attack, only this time his opponents thundered toward the Philippines with the greatest mast carrier air power in history. Ironically, the planes which he would order into combat were chiefly the familiar Zero fighters with which he had fought some 4 years before. Vice Admiral Onishi's hands were literally tied even before he made his first official move. Not only were his fighter planes primarily the all-too-familiar Zero, but he could not scrape together from every field in the Philippines more than 30 serviceable fighters. By patching up every remaining Type 1 Betty bomber on the islands, he managed to increase his defensive force of operational aircraft to the pitiful total of only 60 planes. Onishi realized the futility of his task, that not even by the wildest stretch of the imagination could he hope, through orthodox methods of attack, to inflict heavy damage upon or to destroy the American carriers so well guarded by the Hellcat fighter planes. Without fighter plane escort, Onishi mused, even the mighty battleships Yamato and Musashi, despite their 18-inch guns and slabs of armor plating, would be destroyed by American carrier bombers long before they would have the opportunity even to see the enemy fleet, let alone engage it in combat. Since orthodox methods of attack could no longer be pursued to carry out his mission, Onishi turned to the possibility of kamikaze attacks, suicide dive bombing with Zero fighters carrying 550-pound bombs. The airplane most likely to break through the defending cordon of Hellcats, and the most accurate of all our dive bombers, the Zero was the only logical choice for the suicide missions. However, the Admiral could not simply order his subordinates to commit suicide in mass numbers, not even in the Japanese Navy, where surrender could not be tolerated. Suicide attack on a mass, calculated scale was unknown to war, and Onishi knew that he would have to make the request to his pilots personally. On the evening of October 19th, the Admiral arrived at Clark Field on Luzon Island, the major Zero fighter base in the Philippines, to confer with the executive officers of the Zero Fighter Corps. At the meeting, he made his formal request for the kamikaze attacks. Even to the pilots who had fought against overwhelming odds, the request was not received without certain shock. The precarious position of the Japanese fleet and air groups in the Philippines was, however, well understood by every man. They fully knew how slight were the chances of staving off the anticipated American assaults. All the pilots unanimously agreed to the admiral's request. Onishi designated the Zero groups which would engage in the suicide operations as the Kamikaze Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Kamikaze Special Attack Squad, after the Kamikaze, Divine Typhoon, which Japanese history records as having twice wrecked Kublai Khan's powerful Mongolian invasion force attacking Kyushu in the 13th century. While Onishi prepared his suicide squads, the Philippines resounded with the thunder of new battles. Kurita, Shima, and Ozawa rushed to the islands to attack the vulnerable American transports, which even then poured men, tanks, guns, and supplies ashore on Leyte. On the 24th, the great showdown began. American carrier planes sighted the long-sought battleship fleet of Vice Admiral Kurita steaming at full speed for the waters east of Leyte Island. The enemy dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters screamed in to attack in unending waves. Every ship put up a withering anti-aircraft barrage, but even this shower of steel and fire did little to divert the attacking planes. Helldivers hurled their bombs at great speed into the battleships, and the lumbering Avengers, protected by Hellcat fighters all the way, slid their torpedoes into the water and sent them true to their mark. Before long, the giant Musashi was a shattered hulk, which, according to Captain Kenkichi Kato, the ship's executive officer, had received at least 30 bombs and 26 torpedoes. Her crew attempted to beach her on Sibuyan Island, but the battleship capsized and sank, taking more than 1,200 men with her. Heavy bombs smashed into the deck of the Yamato. Despite the surface damage, the ship's fighting power was unimpaired. The heavy cruiser Miyoko staggered with a torpedo hit in her side and was put out of action. The battleships Haruna and Kongo were damaged, as were several other ships. This was exactly what Onishi had forecast. Without air superiority, even the two greatest warships ever built were helpless before the enemy carrier dive and torpedo bombers. By this time, Onishi's Zero pilots were beginning to regard the suicide attacks which they were planning as the only possible course to take. Conventional attack would produce nothing but a higher total for the American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Nothing could be done against the granite-like defences of the carrier task forces. On October 21st and 23, two Kamikaze Zeros with 550-pound bombs left their air bases on their first missions, but failed to find enemy carriers and returned. Battered by the carrier plane attacks, Kurita withdrew his fleet from San Bernardino Strait, where he lay at the mercy of the enemy planes. In 7 hours, the Americans made more than 250 sorties against his ships. Kurita felt that, if he were to continue the attempt to force his way through the strait, he would merely offer the enemy planes an unexcelled opportunity to wipe out the remainder of his fleet. Later the same day, Kurita came about in the Sibuyan Sea and withdrew to the west. He would attempt to force a decisive last battle with the enemy ships on the 25th. Kurita did not retreat for long. The tough little admiral, stung by his defeat, soon turned and headed back towards San Bernardino Strait. As the darkness of the night faded, Kurita's group of 4 battleships and other warships, groping their way through the strait without benefit of air search, blundered into an American group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The light enemy force should not have had the slightest chance of survival, but they fought with amazing courage. Against Kurita's heavy guns, they lost the Gambier Bay. When Kurita withdrew, the Hotel, Johnston, and Samuel B. Roberts were either sunk or on the way down, and the Fanshawe Bay, Kalinin Bay, Dennis, and Heermann had suffered crippling damage. The battle, involving all 3 Japanese fleet units, was at its climax. On the morning of October 25th, the Kamikaze Zeros led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki left on their first missions. 1 Zero plunged into the carrier Santee, exploding just forward of the deck elevator. 2 others dove at the Sangamon and the Petroff Bay. Our reports stated the ships were hit, but we learned later that defending anti-aircraft fire caused the diving fighters to hit the water close by the ships. A few minutes later, although Onishi was not aware of it at the time, one of our submarines put a torpedo into the damaged Santee. The 4th Zero crashed into the carrier Suwannee, exploding in the ship's hangar and causing heavy casualties and severe damage. Before noon, 6 other Zeros went into their final dives. The Zero plunging into the carrier St. Lo sent its bomb through the flight deck, which set off violent explosions. Another Zero crashed into Kitkun Bay. 3 Zeros attacked the Kalinin Bay. 2 of them exploded on the flight deck. Less than 30 minutes later, the St. Lo broke in two and sank. The escorting Zero fighters confirmed these hits. Onishi felt he was fully justified in the kamikaze attacks, as illustrated in the case of the carrier St. Lo. This ship had escaped the 18-inch guns of the Yamato, and like other American carriers, its planes had fought off our weak air attacks. A single kamikaze destroyed the vessel. This second Battle of the Philippines demonstrated clearly that future attacks against the American warships, notably the carriers, would have to be performed by the kamikaze planes if Japan was to have even the slimmest opportunity for salvaging an effective defense of her homeland. Our navy had suffered disastrously in the far-flung sea-air battle, and we had lost the battleships Musashi, Yamashiro, and Fuso, the large carrier Zuikaku, the 3 light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, the 6 heavy cruisers Atago, Maya, Chokai, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Mogami, the 4 light cruisers Abukuma, Kinu, Tama, and Noshiro, and the 11 destroyers Wakaba, Yamagumo, Michishio, Shiranuhi, Uranami, Akitsuki, Asagumo, Hatsutsuki, Nawake, Hayashimo, and Fujinami. In contrast, American ships sunk were the light carrier Princeton, the escort carriers Gambia Bay and St. Lo, the destroyers Johnston and Hoel, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. Encouraged by the potentialities of the kamikaze attacks, Onishi hastily recruited his new suicide forces and modified the airplanes to be used. As his new units became available, they were thrown into the mounting battle against American warships and transports. As anticipated, we achieved results far beyond those possible through the orthodox method of attack. Not only the Zeros were used for the kamikaze dives. As there arrived in the Philippines Val and Judy dive bombers and Francis twin-engined bombers, these were added to the roster of the suicide attack groups. Stimulated by Onishi's success in the kamikaze operations, Army Air Force units in the Philippines studied our planes and methods of operation. Soon the Navy groups were joined by the Army pilots and air crews in the increasing suicide bombings. Despite the high ratio of strikes against the American fleet forces, we could not prevent the enemy from invading the various islands. The initial carrier strikes against our airfields had accomplished their purpose. We did not have enough airplanes in the Philippines, even when employed for kamikaze attacks, to thwart the American operations. One of our most successful kamikaze attacks occurred on November 35, 1944. 27 fighters and bombers were converging on an enemy carrier task force. A group of 6 Zeros and 2 Judys, led by Lieutenant Kimiyoshi Takatake, on their way to join the other planes for the attack, sighted another carrier fleet. Escorted by 6 Zero fighters, they raced in to attack the enemy ships. The large aircraft carrier Essex was only lightly damaged, but our planes caused heavy damage to 2 sister carriers, as well as the small carrier Independence. 2 of the 6 escorting fighters were shot down. The returning 4 provided confirmation of the attacks. On January 25, 1945, our planes made the last kamikaze attack in the Philippines. American troops fought savagely for, and won, a beachhead on Lingayen Bay in Luzon Island. During the landing operation, we mounted the final kamikaze assault with every available airplane. Even this last maximum effort, while increasing the list of damaged and sunk enemy ships, could not prevent the Americans from effecting their invasion operations where and when they chose. The table immediately below lists the types and number of planes used for the kamikaze attacks. As these figures indicate, the Zeros were used most often for kamikaze attacks in the Philippines area. Of the aggregate aircraft which left their bases, 74% were Zeros. 79% of all planes actually executing the suicide dives were Zeros. We maintained, separate from the kamikaze groups, a minimum number of fighters which both guided and escorted the suicide planes to their targets, and, of course, confirmed the results of these attacks. We employed an aggregate of 249 planes for this purpose, of which 238 were Zeros. In January 1945, after the bulk of the First Air Fleet transferred from the Philippines to Formosa, 4 kamikaze attacks were made, 2 each on January 15th and 21. Between October 25, 1944, when the kamikaze pilots made their first successful attack, and January 25, 1945, we estimated that our suicide pilots inflicted from light to severe damage to at least 50 American vessels of all types. These included 6 large aircraft carriers, 4 of which were identified as the Intrepid, Franklin, Essex, and Lexington, the 2 small aircraft carriers Belleau Wood and Independence, and the escort carrier St. Lo. It was impossible at the time, of course, to determine specifically the names of those carriers our planes had struck, such as the Santee, Suwannee, etc., until corroboration could be received through American reports. Confirmation by our escorting Zero fighters was at best a questionable affair, because of the speed of the attacks, the fierce fighter and anti-aircraft defences, and the short period of time over the target area. On January 31, 1945, the Formosa Air Base reported that one of its kamikaze planes had scored a direct strike on the large American aircraft carrier Ticonderoga, setting the vessel afire, and that later another suicide plane dove into the burning ship, the explosion of the impact spreading the flames and causing heavy damage. Although the first kamikaze attacks occurred with the Zero fighter plane in October 1944, the Navy had considered this last chance means of assault several months prior to the first suicide bombing. In the several months preceding the actual inception of kamikaze attacks, the Navy studied various proposals for such raids from several sources within the organization. The first recommendation, in fact, for employing the OK, Cherry Blossom suicide plane, was obtained from an ensign Mitsuo Ota. In late 1943, and early Ota participated in the desperate battles waged by our land and carrier-based air groups against the Americans, notably the hard-hitting, fast-moving enemy task forces. Later, caught in the overwhelming defeats in the Mariana and Caroline Islands, defeats again inflicted by enemy carriers, Ota had an excellent opportunity to study at close hand the deficiencies of our attack methods. Clearly, the only means of salvaging a war in which the enemy ravaged our most powerful bases with relative impunity was to destroy his weakest link, his carriers. Ota proposed to his superiors that, since conventional level, dive and torpedo bombing accomplished little against the American task forces other than an alarming loss of our planes, we achieve the accuracy required to destroy enemy warships through piloted bombs. The young ensign's proposal met little opposition and was pushed through official channels for high-level consideration. Those officers consulted on the new plan had little choice but to concur with the decision for suicide bombing. In a navy which would not sanction defeat and whose planes rarely could break through the defending screens of Hellcat fighters, suicide bombing provided the sole means of inflicting heavy damage upon, or sinking, the enemy capital ships. In August 1944, the Naval Air Research and Development Center instituted an emergency development program of special piloted glide bombs, which bore the first character of Ota, and which henceforth came to be known as the Marudai Project. From late October to November, we held accelerated flight tests of the new glide bombs. Tokyo established a new air corps charged with the mission of operating the Marudai weapons, and by the close of November, pilot training was well on its way. Captain Motoharu Okamura, one of Japan's most famous senior fighter pilots, became the corps' commander. Okamura selected as his first flyers experienced fighter and dive bomber pilots. Actually, these pilots were selected prior to the first kamikaze attacks in the Philippines. The selection was unnecessary, beyond the critical choices made by Okamura. Volunteers poured in by the thousands for the new operation, despite the special nature of their future missions. The new unit was designated Jinrai Butai, Corps of Divine Thunder. Even as they trained in their new, small piloted bombs, Japan received the news of the first kamikaze attacks with Zero fighters in the Philippine theater. Frankly, the Jinrai Butai pilots were disappointed in that they had not led the first of the kamikaze bombings. Where the suicide bombing Zero planes were limited by the 550-pound bombs they carried with respect to the damage they could inflict upon the enemy vessels, the Marudai glide bombs would carry a 640-pound warhead, powerful enough to sink even a large warship with one suicide plane. The first service glide bomb was designated the Oka Model 2. The first production Oka, cherry blossom bombs were to be assigned first to the Philippines, then Formosa, and last to Okinawa. The Americans never realized that they had struck a telling blow against our initial operations with the glide bombs. In late November 1944, the giant 68,000-ton aircraft carrier Shinano left Yokosuka on its maiden voyage. Aboard the converted Yamato-type battleship were 50 of the new Oka bombs. On November 29th, the Shinano went to the bottom off Shio Point, south of Osaka, several hours after the enemy submarine Archerfish had put 6 torpedoes into the world's greatest carrier. All 50 glide bombs were lost with the ship. Later in the war, we shipped a number of Oka bombs to Formosa and Okinawa. During the savage fight for Iwo Jima Island in February 1945, we made several combat experiments with the Oka bombs, but failed to find an opportunity then in which we could determine the new weapon's effect. On March 21, 1945, the Oks were first used in actual combat. American carriers had stormed off Japan's western shore, sending fighters and bombers out to attack our factories and cities with machine guns, cannon, rockets, and bombs. The task forces literally dared the Navy to do its worst. On the 18th, with the enemy fleets beginning their withdrawals, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Commander-in-Chief of the land-based 5th Air Fleet and commander of all Navy Air Force units in the Kyushu area, ordered Captain Okamura to attack the American carriers with his Oka bombs. Lieutenant Commander Goro Nonaka led 16 Type 1 Betty bombers, each carrying an Oka Model 2, and 2 regularly armed Betty bombers from the Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu in search of the enemy carrier fleet. 30 Zero fighters escorted the bomber formation. Originally, 55 fighters had been scheduled for the escort mission, but the preceding day's battles resulted in the loss or damage of many fighters. Okamura's staff felt that the 30 Zeros could not provide sufficient protection to allow the bombers to break through the defending Hellcats, but Admiral Ugaki ordered the attack to be pressed despite any opposition. Lieutenant Commander Nonaka led his planes over the open sea with little hope for his own personal survival. 300 miles southeast of Kyushu and only 50 nautical miles from the enemy carriers, it appeared as if he would actually have the opportunity to strike a hard blow at the fleet. Suddenly at least 50 Hellcat fighters screamed down to attack. The 30 defending Zeros fought a furious but futile battle. Shortly afterward, every one of the 18 bombers plunged into the ocean, as well as 15 Zeros. The Hellcat's screen still was too tough to break through. The only other occasions during which Oka glide bombs were used against the Americans took place during the defense of Okinawa. A total of 74 Oka bombs left their bases. 56 Okas either were released from their mother planes or were shot down while still attached to the carrying plane. Of this number, we received confirmation of an Oka hit on April 16th, and pilots reported many other successful suicide dives into enemy ships. However, in many cases, our observation planes failed to elude the pursuing Hellcat fighters, and confirmation was at the least quite questionable. Not until the war's end did we receive definite reports that the majority of the Okas had in fact caused appreciable damage to the American warships, and that, as was to be expected, the appearance of the piloted suicide bombs had a telling effect upon enemy morale. The Americans had their own identification for the Oka bombs, giving the suicide planes the code name of Baka, stupid. Our officers regretted that they did not have the opportunity to employ the Okas on the scale originally planned. They felt that several hundred of these suicide gliders with their powerful warheads could have raised havoc with the American fleets. During the last year of the war, the Navy pressed development of Oka variations for suicide attacks. These included the jet engine-propelled Oka Model 22, the turbojet-propelled Oka Model 33 and 43, the turbojet engine Kicker, Mandarin Orange Blossom, the PulseJet Biker, Plum Blossom, and the Shinryu, Divine Dragon glider, which utilized solid rockets for takeoff. Developing their own model from Navy types, the Army launched a program to build the all-steel tsurugi sword, in which any type of reciprocating engine could be mounted. The Navy version of this plane was the Toka, Wisteria Blossom. However, even as the first test flights of the Kika, Shinryu, and the Tsurugi began, the war ended. Even as the Navy and the Army laboured to perfect and to place in production the small, speedy, piloted bombs, the scene of kamikaze operations with existing fighters and bombers shifted from the Philippines to the waters near Japan. In the defence of Iwo Jima Island in February of 1945, our pilots made several suicide attacks against the enemy carriers, with one strike confirmed. After March of 1945, more than half of our pilots resorted to kamikaze attacks. American and British vessels in the waters off western Japan and Okinawa were subjected to repeated raids by the 3rd, 5th and 10th Air Fleets in Kyushu and the 1st Air Fleet in Formosa. We employed a variety of aircraft types for the suicide bombings. These were, in order of the number used, the Zero, Suisei, Judy, Ginga, Francis, Val, Shiragiku, a navigation and crew trainer, Kate, Betty, Nell, Tenzin, Jill, Type 96 learner-based dive bomber, and various types of reconnaissance seaplanes. An aggregate of 597 Zeros left their bases in Japan to raid the enemy ships. 330 of these planes actually made suicide dives. An aggregate of 865 planes of all other types took off on missions, and 516 of these bombed the enemy fleet. Thus, 846 planes out of an aggregate of 1,462 which were left on missions actually completed the bombings. From the Formosa bases, an aggregate of 239 Zeros and 118 other type planes flew against the enemy. 34 Zeros and 44 other types completed their suicide dives. The majority of the kamikaze missions flew from Japan simply because the Zero fighters, operating from Formosa, lacked the range necessary to search for and attack their targets. Among the enemy warships damaged in these kamikaze operations were the carriers Wasp, Franklin, Hancock, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and Enterprise. During the same period of time, our planes damaged only a few enemy vessels through attacks other than suicide dives. Despite the frantic attempts to break up the American fleets, the enemy continued to invade the islands along our shrinking defense lines and sent his carriers to smash any objective within the range of his airplanes, which of course meant the very heart of Japan. Even the desperate suicide measures could not halt the colossal war machine advancing against our country. During these last-ditch defense measures, the Zero fighter again played the dominant role. A total of 2,363 Navy planes, including the Okas, took off on kamikaze flights. 1,189 were Zero fighters. Of the 1,189 planes which actually completed their suicide missions, 530 were Zeros. The kamikaze suicide attacks took the lives of approximately 2,530 Navy pilots and aircrew members, and at least an equal number of Army pilots and aircrew perished. On August 15, 1945, the day of our surrender, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had commanded the suicide bombings from Kyushu, flew the last kamikaze mission of the war and followed his men by diving against an enemy warship off Okinawa. Also in the war's closing hour, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff and the originator of the kamikaze operations, chose death by harakiri rather than surrender. Thus ended the kamikazes.